Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. Today is Wednesday, and I'm going to be doing my Q&A. So basically, people have asked me a few questions this week, and I will give you my answers. This week only got 3 questions. So there's a few people that asked questions, but they were questions that I had previously answered, so I didn't want to really rehash a lot of old stuff, so I just gave them links to my previous Q&A videos. But what I wanted to do, since I only got a few questions this week, I wanted to get into bigger details or more details to really fully answer these questions. And the first question is, are there any it's from Klecto6. So if you ask me a question, I will actually shout your name out. He asked me this through Instagram, so you can follow me on Instagram. I put the link below. Klecto6 asked, are there any magazines comparable in our hobby today to Warren's? There's a Wednesday question. Magazines currently produced in today's marketplace. Are there any? Are you buying any? Okay, so I actually brought a bunch to show you, and I also brought some Warren books to show as well. So I kind of wanted you to see what Warren was. Warren was famous for Vampirella, Creepy Eerie, but one of its flagship comics, or magazines, I should say, it's a magazine, was actually called Famous Monsters. And this is its 100th issue, kind of a giant size one. And I also brought, just because it shows all the different covers, Famous Monsters 101. So I actually have all the Famous Monsters. But this magazine was really, really popular in the from 1958 all the way up to 1983, when Warren Publishing went out of business. And it was known for really like being a kind of like similar to like Fangoria or like Screen Rant or some kind of like screen like horror movie like review thing, where or more of a fan appreciation of the horror movies. And they would basically have like still photos of the different horror movies, and they would showcase them. So it was a pretty great magazine, and it actually inspired like creators like Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and a bunch of others attribute Famous Monsters for really getting them interested in producing movies. So very influential magazine. Now there has been since the magazine has gone out of business back in 1983, there's been a few times where they tried to revive Famous Monsters, and I will show you a few of those. One sec here. I actually have a bunch that I want to show. So it was first done by Dynacom, and this is Dynacom. They started out with issues 200 up, and basically they try to bring back Famous Monsters, but they ended up going out of business themselves. They had some financial issues, and they weren't able to sustain the comic magazine, I should say. And then it was taken over by another company. I think they just called themselves Warren. And this is their version. And they actually recently went out of business as well. Well, they stopped publishing, I should say. And this is Famous Monsters. This is from 2014. So this is relatively recent. And this is also from 2014. I collected these as well because I tried to get, I'm a completionist. I'd like to get all of the Warren related ones. Oh, and actually their name of the company is Movieland Classics. And they actually produced a few other titles as well. But these were like Famous Monsters, and the bringing back of Famous Monsters was kind of their flagship as well. So there's been other publishers that have also tried to do sort of a similar thing to Warren. And they often focused on the good girl or the bad girl or the scream girl. More the scream, I guess, would be um the proper term. And some of them were femme fatales. And there was even a TV series named after this magazine, Femme Fatales. And it was really, a magazine that focused on the women, the scream queens of of horror and the movies. So it's just it was a pretty good magazine. A bit of nudity, so not it was a little bit less risque than another magazine called Scream Queens, which I'm not showing. Um, I actually collected that as well. Scream Queens was produced by Hustler, and they focus more on the more erotic horror genre. And actually, it was actually interesting because the way Scream Queens came about was they just had one issue of Hustler where they talked about women in horror, and that one issue of Hustler magazine became so popular that people asked, for a dedicated magazine about women in horror and more of the erotic side. So they produced a series called Scream Queens. And the funny thing is, there's a bit of a tie between that story and what happened with Warren Publishing. So Warren Publishing had the exact same story. What happened was Warren produced a comic called After Hours, and they only went 4 issues. It was like their attempt to rip off Playboy at the time, which was the big adult comic, a magazine. Um, and what happened was they produced one issue where they talked about horror movies, and people loved that issue more than the adult stuff. And they ended up saying, "Hey, let's just stop the adult things and focus on horror movies." And that's how Famous Monsters was created. But so there's funny how there's modern parallels to what happened with Warren as well. So this is Femme Fatales number one. Another magazine, another kind of a little bit more adult side, is Draculina. And this one also has disappeared, and it just really didn't sustain itself. It lasted for about 10, 15 years, though. But a lot of the magazine companies, they're really struggling with with people going online, reading things online. It's just really hard to maintain these like vast distributions of magazines because people just prefer to read things online. It's not like comics. Comic magazines really struggle compared to comics. Comics, there's still that small fan base that maintains the publishing of comics. Whereas magazines, they're very expensive to produce, and it's very hard to maintain that distribution. But there has been companies recently that have tried to bring back magazines and bring back kind of like the Vampirellas and the Creepy Eries and stuff like that. And one of those magazine companies is Warrant. So it's Warrant instead of Warren. And this is Vampirus Carmella. So it's kind of playing um, off of Vampirella, and it actually has a very similar homage cover to the first Vampirella, where you have her with the bat wings and the moon in the background. So they have really tried to bring back a lot of that Warren stuff, and a lot of the artists that have contributed to this magazine are actually ones that worked on the original Warren magazines. So there's this one, there's Crips, or Creeps, I should say, Creeps, and they're kind of interesting. They're very similar to the old Warren magazines, so it's quite good. And I actually have a couple issues of that I can show, and I do collect these. So that was I believe that was William Dubay, the previous one, and this is Saint Julian. So some kind of modern Warren Publishing, modern takes on Warren Publishing, similar kind of stories. And this for example was published back in May. So I think it's up to issue 5 or 6 right now. And I collect them all. So that's my look at the modern versions of Warren. I hope it's been interesting. And there are lots of really great magazines that really have been overlooked by the general public. I really do believe that people should kind of take more interest in the magazines. They just never hold the value that comics do, but they are cool. And I believe that Warren is one of those things where it has been overlooked for way too long. And it really deserves to have more love because it created so many wonderful characters, and just really awesome artists were involved with it. So yeah, that's my thing on Warren. Okay, next question. Richard Lashira wrote, how did Dell, Western, and Classic Illustrated put their books on the stand without the CCA weren't allowed to normal distribution system? So in my previous video last week, I was talking about how there were 3 holdouts to the Comic Code Authority, CCA. Okay, basically the 3 holdouts were Dell, Western, and Classic Illustrated. And I actually had to do some research for this one because I didn't know. I knew Dell was big. So if you're not familiar with Dell, I'm going to show a few Dells. This is Bugs Bunny. They would produce a lot of Disney stuff. So Bugs Bunny. They produce some Santa stuff. This is these are all kind of major keys actually. And Quick Draw Magawa. So they produced a lot of cartoon characters. And they also did a lot of what they're most famous for is the Dell 4 colors. And they would even do like the popular TV series, and they would publish them in like their comics. So like the Untouchables or Hardy Boys or whatever popular shows there were, they would put them in their little 4-color books, and they would publish them through the 4-color series. And the 4-color series, there was like over 1,000 in that series. So just very big run of comics. So I'm going to give you I wrote it all I wrote it all down. A little bit of a history of Dell, because Dell is kind of like the Dell and Western are kind of related. They actually had a partnership, and I'll get into that. So Dell Comics was a comic book publishing arm of Dell Publishing, which got its start in pulp magazines. It published comics from 1929 to 1974. At its peak, it was the most prominent and successful American company in the medium. In 1953, Dell claimed to be the world's largest comic publisher, selling 26 million copies each month. Okay, that's just massive, right? So, I mean, if you compare that to comics nowadays, like DC or any of those ones, don't even get close to that number. They don't get close to that number. 26 million copies. That's insane. And at the time, just to give you a sense of how big the golden age was, even with 26 million copies being produced each month, that was only 15% of the market. So there was a huge market back then. More people were reading comics, more people were really enjoying comics. And that year of 1953 is very important because it really marks the shift from that golden age to the silver age. And it is because of Frederick Wertham. Now, Frederick Wertham in 1948, he basically put out a thing saying, hey, all the publishers, he said this, he created this Association of Comic Magazine Publishers. And the association had been formed to preempt government intervention in face of criticism of comics, and especially, like not necessarily Dell particularly, but, some of the other publishers like EC and all those ones. So at the time, Dell refused to go to this association. And Dell Vice President Helen Mayer told Congress that Dell had opted out of the association because because they didn't want their less controversial offerings to serve as an umbrella for the crime comic publishers. So she was actually saying, "Hey, we're not like them. We're different. We're more wholesome." And when the Comic Code Authority was formed in 1954, in reaction to Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, Dell again refused to join. Instead, began publishing its comics in with a pledge to parents. Okay, so that was their own Comic Code Authority, that they had this thing called pledge to parents, that promised their editorial process eliminates rather than regulates objectionable material. And this included with a now classic credo: Dell Comics are good comics. Okay, so that was their way of kind of getting around the Comic Code Authority. Now, the interesting thing about Dell, and this is kind of why they had this partnership with Western, was Dell actually was its own distributor. So it didn't have to worry about the Comic Code Authority, because unlike other publishers that relied on distribution, like other companies to do the distribution for them, Dell didn't have to worry about that. So they could get around a lot of the issues that bothered other other publishers like Marvel or DC. So or EC in that case too. Now Bart Betty in his book, he actually wrote a book about this. Frederick Wortham and the Critique of Mass Culture describes a concerted campaign by Dell against the publication of Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, to the extent of recruiting several companies that it licensed characters from, including Warren Brother Cartoons, The Lone Ranger, Edward Rice Burroughs, and sent letters to protest Wortham's publisher Stanley Reinhardt. So Dell actually actively tried to censor Wortham. It's kind of ironic in a way. They do what a lot of modern companies do nowadays. Like they go after not the specific person. Like, don't go after the person, they go after the platforms that host that person. So that was what they did back then with Dell. Like they really saw Wortham's book as a potential to destroy the comic industry, and they were really trying to fight it whatever way they could. And this is how they did it. They went after the publisher of the books themselves. So but it didn't work, obviously. So Dell in this period even bolstered its name by taking out full page ads in the Sunday Evening Post in the late 1952, early 1953 era, and emphasized its wholesomeness in its comics. Now, it's kind of funny because within the Seduction of the Innocent, one of the Dell books was mentioned, and it was a issue of Bugs Bunny. So, it's kind of maybe part of the reason they were so adamant against Wortham was they considered their comics to be very wholesome, and even their comics had managed to make it inside the Seduction of the Innocent. So they were maybe not too happy about that. So what a lot of the things that Dell did, because once the Comic Code Authority did come into play, it really did hurt their publication. Even though they had their own distribution, it wasn't the best situation to be in. So during the mid-50s to 1959, what it relied on was a lot of subscriptions. What it would do is it would sell subscriptions to its Four Colors and other titles. And you could even order a 5-year subscription and get your comics every day, every month. So they had all these things where they kind of basically had their own kind of distribution that they could rely on. And over the years, the reason Dell kind of fell apart as a company was Western, this other part of its company, Western produces Whitman Comics, and they ended up producing a comic called Gold Key, and Gold Key kind of competed with Dell directly. So their partnership with Western had failed, and all of a sudden now they had this rivalry between what used to be like a like a collaborator, and now was a separate publisher. So a separate thing that they had to compete against. And the Gold Key was very successful, very very popular, comics. Um, so what ended up happening was over time, Dell just didn't maintain its market share, and kind of by 1974 it had sort of fallen out of favor. And a lot of the titles that were originally Dell titles got switched over to Gold Key titles. It actually kind of completely failed altogether. Um, and that was, really in 1962 was when that partnership between Dell and Western had kind of fallen apart. Now, uh, and the funny thing was they lost a lot of their talent to to Gold Key, so that was another big killer to their whole brand and market share. So in 1974 they kind of ceased production, and in 1976 they were bought out by Doubleday. So that was the end of Dell altogether. So really, most people cite from 1929 to 1974 was kind of the run of Dell. But really, it was 1976 that they kind of were completely gone, because they were bought out by Doubleday. So that's the little history of Dell and how they got around the Comic Code Authority that a lot of the other publishers really couldn't get around. Like EC basically stopped the publication of its comics because it couldn't create the comics that they wanted to create under the Comic Code Authority. So kind of sad. I'm actually going to be doing maybe a little bit boring video, but this is a video that I think might be useful. I'm going to actually do a video later. Like you'll see it. I actually prepared it. You'll see me wearing almost the same clothes, where I'm going to read the Comic Code Authority, all the rules, and you'll get to see that in a future video. So stay tuned for that. Okay, now the last question is from Rocket Fighter 8, and he basically asks, what comic book collectors or channels do you regularly follow on YouTube? Well, that I actually did a video earlier about this, but I'll reiterate some of them. Some of my favorite channels are Comic Tom. Comic Tom 101. I enjoy his stuff. It's always good to see what is considered hot. It's sort of like I like to listen to the radio, and not only I don't always like the modern music, but I always like to listen to the top 10 or the top whatever number that they they do of the songs, just to always stay a little bit in tune with the current trends in music. Well, I do the same with Comic Tom. I like seeing what are the modern comics that are really hot and popular, and why are they popular. And Comic Tom actually has a lot of these top 10 lists, but he also does like these kind of, the list that I really like is when he looks at more like the comic trends, and he looks at lists which are can run from the golden age all the way up to modern age. So I find those more interesting because I like collecting the golden and silver age and sometimes bronze age comics. So yeah, I find his channel quite good. Another one that I like, and he's a friend of mine, so I like promoting him, is Jerry the Jitterbug. I watch all of his videos. I think his videos are quite good. And he talks a lot about comic restoration. Now, comic restoration isn't something that I really want to partake in myself, but I love seeing these old comics come back to life. And I think it's really interesting to watch his videos and the dedication that he puts into bringing these old comics back to life. I think it's really, really worth watching. So Jerry the Jitterbug, great channel. Another channel that I like is Casually Comics. She's always wearing different wigs. And she basically looks and reads the stories and gives a lot of insight into the stories of, different characters. I just recently watched one of her videos where she was talking about uh, the female version of Galactus, and it was really interesting. And I ended up buying the comic because I was so interested in her video about that comic. So you know, I enjoy that channel a lot, and she's always changing her hair. It's funny. Other channels that I like are Bry's Comics. I think he does a good job of looking at you know, uh, modern comics as well. Another one is Very Gary. He does really good videos as well. Again, mostly modern. Um, who else? Uh, Obviously Mark Ulroyd and his channel, and we partner up. And part of the reason I partnered up with Mark was I actually enjoy his stuff. He has a very British take on comics, and I think that's very interesting. And he looks at a lot of comics that are a little bit under the radar because he's looking at it for what he's interested in. I find that very interesting for myself. That in a way, the comic toms and stuff like that kind of get a little bit repetitive because you see a lot of the same stuff. So I think it's always interesting when you see these other creators that are kind of looking at different stuff. A similar channel to that looks at kind of more modern stuff as well is Bloop. And Bloop does these really great videos where he looks at the top 10. And I'm actually in a little bit of competition with Bloop in a way. Like I was ahead of him like a while ago in terms of number of subscribers, and he just blew past me. It was like not even fair. We hit 1,000 at the same time, so it was kind of interesting. And then now he's got more than me. So you got to subscribe to me so I can win the battle here. So yeah, so that's another great channel, Bloop. And another channel that I really like is I'm trying to think. Journo's Comics and Games. He does a really good. He looks at a lot of stuff. He looks at a lot of different stuff, and he likes to. I find that he does things that are a little bit different than most channels because he'll talk about some of the controversies. He'll talk about some of his thoughts on the whole comic market in general, and I find that very interesting. So I really enjoy that. And yeah, there's a bunch of other channels. There's actually I watch probably about 30 channels. And I feel bad for whenever I'm sort of posed on the like I should have really written them all down because there's so many comic channels that I really love. Keston's is another channel that I really like, and that's why I collaborated with him because I really enjoy his channel. That's Keston's Old School Comics, and he focuses much more on the Golden Age comics, and he does these really highly produced videos that I think are really great. He's really undersubscribed. Like not enough people subscribe to his channel, but he should produce more stuff because his stuff is really great. And there's so many. So yeah, I'll probably do. I did an earlier video where I actually mentioned some channels, and I was trying to pick channels that I didn't mention before. But what I'd like to do is maybe in a future video, specifically go into some more of the channels that I'd love to watch. So stay tuned for that as well. And that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you have questions that you want to ask me, and it can be pretty much anything, please leave a comment below. And that's it. Thanks again. Bye for now.